So we're going to shift gears. We're going to go from the qualitative side to the quantitative side and talk more about sort of the science of quantitative research without getting too academic. I mean, obviously there's a lot of academics to what we do, but we want this to be very real. Just, talking amongst you during the break, it's good that we think in terms of how we can apply this. Many of you are doing research right now, whether you're doing surveys or whether you're crunching data that you already have, because there's so much available now in terms of just data crunching that we can spend a lot of time with our own numbers. So we want to make sure that we do that, but we also look outside, because it's really important that we continue to not only talk to our own people, but we talk to those that are potentials. That's how we grow our audience without, what we say, shooting ourselves in the foot. We don't want to go after that audience without thinking about the audience that we already have. We want to make sure that the ones that got us here are the ones that are going to continue to support us. Even when you change direction with an organization, you kind of reinvent yourself. You have to think about, who do we have right now? And so looking at that from a research point of view and understanding it, I think is really critical to surviving and to continue to be, I think, successful. So we're going to move into kind of that scientific part of the research. Research it's basically a coin with two sides. You've got the qualitative side that Nancy talked about, and then you've got the quantitative side that is the science part of it. Not that the qualitative side isn't. In fact, the focus group originated in social sciences and has been around for a very, very long time. And we in market research sort of borrowed that from the social sciences, and it took on a life of its own. Quantitative research, Nancy mentioned a couple of these things, is really looking at the research from a projectable scientific point of view. It's scientific, it's statistical, purportedly accurate, even though the polls for this election that we just had are questioned, and Max will talk a little bit about that. But it is the science part of what we do. And so we can take that information and project it, and we can form conclusions and draw our opinions. All of the different techniques that we talked about earlier when Nancy was talking about the qualitative side are still things that we do today. Telephone interviewing, on-site surveys, mail, mall intercepts, online. But of course, the biggest piece of this, and the one that is beginning to get bigger and bigger and bigger, is that last one on the list, which is the online survey. But I want to talk about one of these techniques that I think it lends itself to the arts in terms of the on-site survey. It's a self-administered or face-to-face type of survey. You get immediate feedback. It's a popular technique when looking through what kinds of techniques the arts use in one form or another. Sometimes a very simplistic printed, short little questionnaire that's at the venue is one way of gathering information, all the way to very sophisticated tablet types of computers that we're gathering information. But it's very popular, used in a lot of different locations. This technique is actually, compared to a lot of other types of surveys, can be inexpensive. There's lots of software available, a lot of programs that are available, some even free, that you can take and you can program that and put it on a tablet. It'll run on a smartphone, and you can collect that information literally on site. It's great for problem solving and for recognition. So if you are a museum and you use this on-site type of feedback mechanism, if there's a problem with one of the exhibits, you get that information instantly. And if you've got a customer service issue, you get that information instantly on site. And collectively, it's a 24/7 access. kind of scenario where you have that information at your fingertips whenever you want it. You know, that is really the beauty of kind of today's world with this kind of research. You don't have to wait for surveys to be done, to be entered into a database, to be tabulated and reported. It's literally instant. Sometimes too quick, because you have to be careful. You don't want to react too quickly to a trend that maybe is taking place over a period of time. But it does give you, I think, instant access. It's certainly designed for a lot of different platforms. You know, this on-site mobile type of research is designed for today's devices in terms of whether it's a kiosk or a smartphone or a tablet. As Max will talk a little bit about, I mean, a lot of the research that is done today when we're dealing with the customer experience literally is designed for that little device that you've got in your pocket. You know, everything is really, that is our world today, whether we like it or not. That is our world. Everything is in that little tiny device. They're getting bigger and bigger, but that device is really our world, and it's our connectivity to a lot of the things that are out there. And you can still do it the old-fashioned way. If you're on a limited budget and you don't have, you know, capabilities to use the software, use the platforms, there's no reason why you can't still use a traditional approach in getting feedback from your subscribers, your members, or from those that are your visitors. So when you walk into the exhibit hall and you see that, you know, that small little postcard form, that takes us back to the Stone Age when it comes to research. But you'd be surprised how much information you can collect on a 3x5 index card. So don't shortchange yourself. If you can't afford to do the more fancy high-tech types of approaches, do something. Have a system in place where you collect that information, and you can do a lot with that. When you have it that way, obviously you've got to be able to have a system for tabulating and analyzing, and we can talk a little bit about that. But keep that in mind. Don't use that as a barrier for being a research-driven organization, because any kind of research, if it's done well, is really, I think, a good way to get strategic information. And then you can develop, and Max will talk a little bit about this as well, this whole idea of monitoring and having a dashboard of information and statistics that will help you tell you how well you're doing in basically a real-time mode. And I won't steal his thunder, but I think this is kind of today's world, is having that information in a form that you can use and make decisions. So let's briefly talk about, I'm going to tee this up and then talk a little bit about the online survey, which is really the way the world has turned. Today, the online survey, whether it's in a mobile device or on-site, but we are living in an online survey world, and it's going to continue to be that way. It is the preferred method of communication and interaction from the public point of view. When we ask people, how do you want to be engaged? They tell us the best way to do this is email, online, reach me that way. So it's preferred by the public. The participants your public, your audience can complete the surveys at their convenience. It's very popular, but there's also a caveat. There's potential fatigue in terms of too many online surveys or surveys that are not done very well. So kind of keep that in mind, that this is a methodology that is really taken over, but you have to be very careful when you're conducting these surveys that you avoid those challenges in terms of the fatigue factor. It's inexpensive compared to a lot of other types of surveys. In the days when the telephone survey was a major methodology, you would have, literally offices full of people sitting in workstations making phone calls. So these call centers have diminished over a period of time. They've gotten bigger, but there's far fewer of them. But the ability to be able to send out an email with a link, capture that information, or give a member of the audience the opportunity to provide feedback literally instantly, whether you're surveying 10 people or whether you're surveying 10,000 people. It's literally all electrons. So collecting that information, how you deal with it is one challenge, but there's a scalability to this type of research that gives you a huge opportunity to capture information from a lot of those audiences that I talked about earlier. You can host the survey yourself, or you can use other platforms. You get the results literally instantly, and you can act on those. And so if you have a customer service issue, there's ways to dealing with that. And again, Max will talk a little bit about that. What we do when it comes to reaching out to the non-audience segment, people who are not currently part of your attendance population. Today we have panels of people, and these are panels that were used unfortunately in the election in terms of some of those results, but we have panels of people who have opted in to take surveys. So when we want to do a public survey and reach out to people that maybe haven't been part of your audience, we want to ask them questions about interest or motivation or awareness or overall perceptions. We can reach out to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of households and gather that information from people that literally represent the population that we're addressing. And we can do that not only nationally, we can even do it internationally, because these panels are there. Because of the federal regulations now, and you can't just do surveys without reaching out to people who have given you permission to participate in that survey. But there are literally millions and millions of households out there in these panels now. And they're not professional survey takers. These are average people. And we have a huge battery of information in terms of who they are, demographically, lifestyle, activities. We know everything about them, almost too much information about them. But these panels can be really helpful. So we use those to look externally beyond just the audience itself. You can get, obviously, a lot of information from using the software that's out there. So this third-party software that many of you are familiar with, be sure to take a look at that. If you have a limited budget, there's no reason why you can't be doing some kind of deployment of an online survey, because there are just lots of ways to do that I think that you've looked at. And many of you, I'm sure, are doing this right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Max to talk a little bit about not only what Customerville is all about, but the things that they do. They are really on the leading edge of this whole customer experience and engagement process. And as I said in the beginning, all of us are dealing with some type of customer experience, whether it's performing arts, visual arts, museums, all of the different types of activities that are represented within our culture. There's a customer experience that really lends itself to engagement and lends itself to keeping that audience as a part of our audience. That is really, really critical. There's a huge amount of competition for that audience, so the more we're able to understand it and engage them and understand and measure and monitor that, the better off. So Max, I'll turn it over to you to take us through a little bit of this.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? So my name is Max Israel, and I'm founder and CEO of a Seattle company called Customerville. And we help companies all over the world. I think we're working in probably 20 countries right now, get feedback from their customers. So do me a favor, raise your hand if you are currently or you're considering using a survey online to get some feedback from your stakeholders. That's a lot of people. So this is going to sound kind of odd coming from somebody who is the founder of a survey company, but I freaking hate them. Like, they suck. Raise your hand if some part of you agrees with the statement that, okay, there we go. So like everybody, for the people who are, guy who's filming in the back, let me just look right in the camera and say, everybody raise their hand. That's a problem. That's a problem because we need to use this. We need to get feedback from our stakeholders, right? And if the best way to do that is online, the fact that everybody raised their hand when I just said that is going to be a problem. So I want to kind of come away having done one thing today. The thing that makes my company a little bit different about in this idea of getting feedback online is that from our point of view, we never really understood. And starting about 6 or 7 years ago, we started getting almost a little angry about the fact that we couldn't answer a fundamental question. Why is it that a face-to-face conversation between people can go so well? People are incredibly sensitive feedback devices. You are a precision feedback device. You can look at somebody's body language from 100 yards away. If you've ever seen a child or a loved one that you know, somebody you know from 100 yards away, you can look at them and know if something's wrong. How is that, right? Have you ever had this experience where you were talking to somebody and you realized they weren't really paying attention? Their eyes were kind of out of focus? Raise your hand if you've ever seen that. Anybody ever seen that before? Yeah, no, now I know, I do it sometimes too. The difference between, we're 2 meters away. The difference between my eyes being focused and out of focus is a tiny fraction of a millimeter, right? And yet you're so sensitive, you know that. I'll tell you something really interesting, and I'm kind of going off script a little bit here, but people are talking more about surveys and polling right now than ever before because we've seen in Great Britain and with Brexit and with the presidential election, we've seen a massive failing of that methodology. For most of human history, we actually live in incredibly peaceful times. Statistically, this is the safest time you've ever been able to be human. I highly recommend this time if you have the choice. For most of human history, you probably met your end as the result of another human. Humans are violent. And so for a very long time, your ability to quickly look at somebody and understand, is this person okay? Is this person a threat? Is this person okay? That was really important. And so a huge part of your brain over several million years evolved to be very good at that. So what we do at my company is we figured that the best way we can understand this and make surveys better is with your help. We use the arts. For every programmer, we employ a designer or an artist. We study the performing arts. We study theater actors. We go to museums and look at paintings and understand how is it that somebody who, I was in New York last week with somebody massively smarter than I, a PhD, talking about how an artist managed to, and just with nothing more than a brush and a candle, managed to convey in a split second a piece of emotion that it was just fascinating to me. But by looking at that, we can learn how can we make surveys behave more like people? How can we make them empathize? So we're going to talk to you today about, that's quite a title. The only thing that title has going for it is it could win a contest called World's Worst Title. That's a long title. Right, let's unpack this a little bit. Anybody know, does anybody here know, has everybody heard of Asperger's? Anybody know what Asperger's is? Okay. We'll explain a little bit about it. There is an emerging backlash. We get a lot of surveys. In fact, GMA Research helped us. I'll show you a chart. I think I've got a chart in this. There are a lot of organizations who are competing with you to get feedback online using a survey. We think that in 2015 that was 20 billion, and we think by the end of this year, Americans will have been asked for feedback, hang on guys, 40 billion times. So you see a decrease in survey response rates. You see a decrease in brand perception. If you screw this up and you send a bad survey to your stakeholders, some things can happen. You cannot get the information you needed, but also imagine if you personally were in front of a stakeholder and you had a terrible conversation, if you did not display emotional intelligence. If you asked them a question and then they had the distinct impression that you really didn't care, that you weren't even listening, would that be a good thing? It would not. That would probably damage the relationship. So you're seeing the same thing happen here with online surveys. It's another form of interaction. It's another form of interaction that now is being held to a higher and higher standard. So this is going to freak you out a little bit, but I want you to know there is an answer, and the people in this room are probably better qualified than corporate America to respond to this. This is based on a wonderful study that our friends at GMA Research helped us with. If you look back in 2012, 46% of people said, yeah, I was asked for feedback online more than 5 times per week. By 2016, that number had climbed to 80%. So 80% of people were asked for feedback more than 5 times per week. But what's really interesting about this is that the increase between 2015 and 2016 was almost completely due to people who were asked for feedback. This is not a typo, 11 to 50 times per week. So people are overwhelmed. You need to get feedback using online surveys. It's a very important part of your ability to plan, for your ability to respond, and yet the world is awash with surveys, and most of them are awful. So why do people dislike surveys? Here's some answers you're going to see. They're too long. They have poor UX. UX is geek talk for user experience, the ability to use the interface on your phone or on a tablet or whatever is bad. The public's not interested in sharing feedback. These are things you're going to hear. I don't like conversations that take longer than 10 seconds. Nobody ever said that, right? People will say, surveys are too long. We got to make them short. Whatever our survey is, let's make it only takes 10 seconds. I don't take surveys that are longer than 10 seconds. That's ridiculous. Nobody ever said that about a human conversation. Nobody. So if your survey is good, if it functions in the same way you would as an interlocutor with your stakeholder, the fact that it's 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute, that shouldn't matter, right? It doesn't matter in human conversations. When it comes time to get feedback online, why do we just accept this notion that we can drop the bar so low and behave in ways we would never dream of acting face-to-face? So my company is 13 years old, but starting about 6 or 7 years, I think it was probably more like 6 or 7 years ago, we started getting frustrated with these questions, and we said, if we're going to figure out how to do this better, we should start by asking ourselves, what does a successful feedback interaction look like between people? Let's talk about that. Think about this. What happens in a healthy face-to-face conversation? The sharer of the story is usually doing most of the talking, and the receiver of the story is doing most of the listening, but you're actually doing a lot of things. You're actually sending a lot of information back the other way. You're demonstrating empathy. You may be nodding your head. You're making eye contact. You're doing all kinds of things. If the person is happy, think about little things. Think about the shape of your eyes. Think about the shape of your mouth, how you nod your head, how you move, right? You're sending a lot of signals that say, keep talking, I got it, right? I'm with you. If the person is unhappy, if they're angry, are you going to do the same thing? Of course not. That would look ridiculous. You'd look like a crazy person, right? You would look like you were completely out of sync, and the person would feel uncomfortable, and they would not want to continue talking to you. So you would respond in a different way. What's interesting about this is that both sides of the conversation leave feeling more invested in the conversation and the relationship. You can have a fight with somebody. You can talk about something with somebody, and you're angry at each other, but somehow leave the conversation feeling closer. You ever had that happen? That's basically the entire history of my family. But that's basically it. Isn't that cool? People are good at this stuff. What happens in an unhealthy conversation when this isn't working? Well, the sharer of the story is doing most of the talking, yeah, but the receiver of the story isn't listening authentically. They're either not sending the right nonverbal cues, or they're sending the wrong ones. They're essentially failing to meet the sharer's emotional level. And both sides leave the conversation feeling less invested in the relationship. That's a failure, right? Human interactions fail when empathy fails. That's it. That's when we looked at this, the biggest takeaway, the more we could boil this down, we found that human interactions fail when empathy fails. When we fail to have the ability to take a deep breath, put ourselves in the other person's shoes, and respond appropriately. Who is this guy? We've learned a lot from this guy. His name is Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen. He's a PhD at the University of Cambridge, and he has identified a group of people who actually struggle with empathy. They have a condition called Asperger's. People who have Asperger's frequently are highly intelligent. They're at the distal end of the intelligence spectrum. They're very smart people, but things that you take for granted that maybe most of us have done easily, effortlessly since we were very small children, understanding when the right time is to talk, to listen, to smile, to give those nonverbal cues. People with Asperger's struggle with that. and Dr. Baron Cohen coined a term, mind blindness, essentially the inability to see what's happening from the view of another person, to empathize. Makes it very difficult for them. Does anybody here know somebody with Asperger's? Or has anybody ever worked with somebody with? So a lot of people know a lot about it now. And what's interesting is, thanks to Dr. Baron Cohen's research, I think they've done a lot. Occupational therapists in particular have done a lot to help people with Asperger's understand how to essentially mimic these empathetic cues, which is really important when it's time to let the other person have control of the conversation, how you can respond in ways that put people at ease and engage them. And that's really cool because that tells us a lot about how we can make better online surveys. And what I want to do here is give you some tips so that as you go out and use some of these tools, your surveys behave more like you would. And it turns out that a lot of the ways we do that is understanding the behavioral science behind it. I'll try and give you some of that today, but also use art. Use the very things that make many of your organizations very successful, because it turns out there's a whole group of people out there who are very good at transmitting empathy, at connecting at an emotional level. And if you look at connecting at an emotional level, who in the world does that best? Actors, painters, screenwriters, sculptors, right? These are people who understand what they're doing, so you have a lot of these great assets and inspiration at your disposal. Any questions so far? By the way, the irony behind this is that he is, anybody ever heard of the British humorist Sacha Baron Cohen? It's his cousin. Like, Sacha Baron Cohen made Borat, the most famously mind-blind character ever, and his cousin is the guy who named the condition. I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit here. Let me just, these are three things that occupational therapists have come to use, having the toolkit in terms of helping people with Asperger's empathize. Creating conversational context. If you were coming to visit me at my office and you got lost, right? You wouldn't just roll up to somebody on the street and say, "Can you tell me how to get to Customerville?" They'd look like you were nuts. You'd look crazy, right? The first thing you do is you'd actually do two things before you ask for feedback. The first is you'd make a little social connection. You do that with a smile, a wave. You'd wave. People wave for an interesting reason. You've been conditioned over a very long time to do this because it shows I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not armed. And so you'd wave and you'd make a smile. You'd use a little self-deprecating gesture. And then you'd give a little context. You'd say, "Hey, listen, I'm not from this, I'm not from around here or something. I'm trying to find my friends at Customerville." And then the third thing you'd do was you'd ask, "Can you give me a point in the right direction?" Think about that for the rest of your day. As you're seeking information from people, think about what you do. You almost never just ask. You always do those two things first, almost always. As you make your survey, do that. Explain why you're asking. Make a little social connection. Use art, use photography. I'll show you some examples of this. Then ask. This was the big takeaway from us. Survey fatigue and unsuccessful human feedback have that in common. Failure to demonstrate empathy by nonverbal cues. By the way, if you write this down, there's a great tool out there, a great survey company called Typeform, Typeform. Our company does this for companies like Alaska Airlines, Safeco Insurance, Premier Blue Cross. We charge a bloody fortune, right? We're super expensive. And part of it, I'm just being honest with you. The truth is we charge just a ton of money. It's obscene what we charge. We should be ashamed of ourselves. But part of the reason for that is that for us to do what we do in a big enterprise, we send a lot of people and a lot of software and a lot of stuff there, right? So we're not the right, although we especially in the arts community, we donate a lot of time and a lot of software. We're very serious about that because we have so many artists who are part of our team. Even if it doesn't work for us to help you, Typeform is a great survey engine that I think you should look at. It's free or very, very inexpensive. I think they're a Spanish company. I think they're in Barcelona. But go check them out. That is a tool I would recommend in terms of fielding your survey. And then you can take the stuff I'm telling you here and use Typeform, and you'd be in great shape. The cool thing about this is that that these things also share common solutions. You can replicate these nonverbal cues. Let me show you that now Am I okay on time? How much time do I have? About 15 more minutes? Okay. Replicating the nonverbal cues people need to create engagement. Do not do this. It's a joke, but it's not a joke, right? I'm joking about it, but I'm not really laughing about it. If you want to know why this channel is so messed up, why people are cynical about being asked for feedback, it's because we still have too much of this. This looks like you're doing your taxes in the Soviet Union or something. So don't do that. I'm going to show you 3 examples of how we do this for companies. And you don't need to do this. I want to show you what's happening in the background and what our thinking is behind it, so that as you go about this process, you can get feedback online, even without spending a lot of money, but you can do it in an emotionally intelligent way, and you will get better feedback. And through the process of getting feedback from your customers, they'll feel closer to you. The same thing that would happen if you were face-to-face. So that's a great place to start, by the way. Before you do anything online, ask yourself this: would I do this in a face-to-face conversation? Would I do that? If the answer is yes, you're on the right track, right? You are trying to figure out. Regrettably, we can't clone you and send you out to have a cocktail or a cup of coffee with every one of your stakeholders. If we could, that would be marvelous. You'd say just the right thing. You'd say just the right thing. You'd make people, you were talking a little bit before, in the first presentation you saw this idea of making people feel at ease, telling you what's on their mind. You would do that, but we can't clone you. So use some of these tricks to make your survey do that in your stead. Look what's happening here. We're striving for a conversation. So what's interesting about this, I talked about conversational context before you ask, involve somebody in your story. That's what we're doing here. This is for an insurance company, and you can see we've got photos of their team members, of employees of the company, and we're explaining, what are we trying to do? What's our vision? Well, we're in this area of the survey, we're talking about how knowledge is only half the game, and it's not enough that I've got all this knowledge and experience in my field. I need to be capable of making it all meaningful to you. Once I do that, I've explained what we're trying to do and what the story is behind it. Now I'm prepared to ask some questions, and we'll take them through looks like a magazine, where we're walking them through the behind the scenes. We're kind of pulling the curtain back and taking them behind the scenes in this company. We're creating context and meaning. We're taking what we call a storytelling approach. And people are very thoughtful about this. They read the questions, they look at them, they'll think. They'll give you very good feedback. You can do that. Introduce your mission. Bring people into your story. Give them permission to disagree with you. All of those things. This is a very difficult survey. This is a survey, we're working for a pharmaceutical company here, and we're getting feedback from oncologists. We're getting feedback from oncologists who are treating people who have a lethal form of cancer. And this is a remarkable new therapy for a type of cancer called pancreatic cancer. It's devastating. It's very dangerous. This is a remarkable therapy that this pharmaceutical company has. And we need to get oncologists, who are very busy people. If they're not taking time to complete a survey, they're saving somebody's life, running their practice, dealing with the administration of their practice, and maybe, heaven forbid, having some time with their family. So I've got to get this person to believe, hey, I swear, we're really listening. This is important. And so we're doing some things here that I wish I had an animated version of this, but we're taking them through a survey where we're giving kind of a hero statement about what we want to see happen. We've got some hero photos in the background, and then as the respondent hovers over this, what's interesting is the photos will change or desaturate. You need that. If you're telling me a story about something, you need to see a reaction in my face. If you tell me a story and something's very serious or dangerous or bad, you need to see me react in the right way. If I keep smiling and nodding, that's not going to work. You're not going to want to keep telling me the story. So as we take people through, in this particular approach, as we take people through this survey, we're changing the art. And some of these tools will allow you to do that, right? As the answers change, we're responding in the way a human would. This is for Premera Blue Cross. Same thing, we're taking them through. This is probably the most innovative and the farthest reaching customer experience measurement program in the history of healthcare. Premera Blue Cross. So does everybody know that company? This is a remarkable company. There are 30-something Blue Cross Blue Shield companies in the US, and they are a fascinating example of a company really trying to get closer to their customer and their patient. And the same thing, you can see where we're creating kind of hero photos here. And then as people agree or disagree, the photos will change, or the tone of them will change. we're making hero statements, and we want to know whether or not we live up to it. And early on, we'll say, listen, we know we don't live up. This is amazing. If you've ever dealt with a health insurance company, it's frequently not very satisfying. They come right at you and say that. They say, we hate it. The woman, did you ever get an explanation of benefits? Like people, I wish you could see what I just saw. Half of you went, oh God. I'm going to tell you a story and you're going to laugh. The woman who runs that department had a baby and ended up in collections because she couldn't understand the explanations of benefits. So we want to put her up there and say, I had a baby, I work here, and I ended up in collections. I got calls because I couldn't understand the EOB. I hate them. And we're trying desperately to fix them. We really want to fix them. I get up early every day to make this happen. Help me do that. This is another concept. If things don't go right, if you were having a face-to-face conversation and you're asking for information and suddenly you saw that the person wasn't happy, that they had something on their mind, that something had gone badly, you wouldn't robotically keep motoring ahead on the conversation. You do some things that you've known how to do instinctively and intuitively since you were very small, which is you'd say, hey, let me give conversation back to you. Tell me what's going on. You'd empathize, you'd start listening, you'd change your body language, and you'd know to give the control to that person. What's interesting is when you get feedback, and even the best organization in this room, you're going to get some negative feedback. What happens when people when you see really angry feedback, very frequently it's not the thing that went wrong, it's that they feel like you're not listening, right? And so to kind of separate those things and get really clean, good feedback about what went wrong, what can you do about it, and reduce the anger, do what you would do face-to-face. So in this case, you can see that this is for Alaska Airlines. We're taking you through your customer journey. You went to the airport, you checked in, you got on the plane. We know what plane you were on. We know who the employees were, and we're showing you photos of these people, right? But if we start seeing bad grades, the thing will stop and it'll say, listen, I'm really sorry. This is an executive who's in charge of that part of the business. It looks like something didn't go right. Thanks for the survey. You can keep taking it and you'll still be able to tell me what went wrong, or we can just stop this right now and you can tell me exactly what went wrong. And I'm going to reassure you, we are going to look at this within a minute, and we're going to be looking at it today. This is important. You're important. And the fact that you're angry is not okay. So as you go through and you design your own surveys or you work with somebody to make your surveys, make sure that they have that level of responsiveness, because sometimes you'd be surprised at how valuable that information can be when people are unhappy. Okay, so I'll end here, I think, with a little thought exercise. We are feedback machines. We have some built-in biases, and I'm going to show you one of them right now. And when I talk to you about this idea, and why am I doing this? I'm doing this because I probably sold you on the idea of something you already knew, which was that when you talk face-to-face with somebody, if you blow that, right, if you aren't paying attention, if you're inauthentic, if you make any number of a host of mistakes, they will write you off. Or at the very least, they won't think very good things about you, and they certainly won't invest in continuing to tell you this story. I think everybody agrees with that. What I'm trying to do is make the argument that you need to hold yourself to that level when you create online feedback, and do that in the ways we've discussed. Tell your story, use art, right? Make it responsive. Those are very important things. We're doing that to make the survey rise to this social level. Now, you may say, okie doke, Max. I understand what you're saying about how people face-to-face interact with each other. That's cool, I agree with that. But when people take a survey, they know they're taking a survey. They're not going to hold you to the same standard. I disagree with you. And this is our little thought exercise. Did anybody in this room see the movie The Hangover or The Hangover 2? Come on, I know you're all arty and sophisticated. Raise your hands. You all saw The Hangover 2. It's okay. This is the American humorist Ed Holmes. And in the movie, he goes out on an all-night bender and wakes up the next morning, and as happens after an all-night bender, some things have gone wrong. One of them is that he is missing a tooth, and it's really funny. I mean, it's horrible. It turns out that that is not a special effect. That's not CGI. Mr. Holmes had had a crown on one of his teeth for many, many years. He was unsatisfied with it and had spoken to his dentist about replacing it. And it turns out that that was right when they were shooting The Hangover 2. And so he had the idea, went to the director and said, here, I'm going to go on Monday. We'll pull the tooth out. We'll shoot all of these the morning after the bender scenes while I don't have the tooth. and then I'll get my new tooth. So we have a photo of him before and after that. So this is Mr. Holmes. Imagine him. Look hard at his picture. What do you see? Nice haircut, good-looking guy, good smile, looks well-groomed. Imagine you have the opportunity, somebody comes by and says, this is Ed. Maybe we should talk to him about being a sponsor, about donating, about supporting us. What would you do? Imagine the thoughts and emotions going through your head. Or he says, tell me about your organization. You bump into him in an airport. Tell me about your organization. If you knew he was a billionaire, you'd freaking miss your flight, wouldn't you, right? This is the same guy. Look at him and ask yourself right now, would you do the same thing? Would any of your behaviors change? Isn't that interesting? So this idea of making decisions based on what you see, the economist Malcolm Gladwell calls it thin slicing, you can't deprogram that. For 3 million years, your survival in large part depended on it. And today, it's still very helpful for you. Sometimes it's counterproductive, but it's very hard to deprogram it. And this is my way of saying to you that when you get feedback online, all of that social wiring you have, all of those things that take context in and make you make these decisions and decide what it feels like when you interact with people, they are still at play just as much online as when you're face-to-face. And I hope, by the way, we're also available. We'll be happy to hop on a call with any of your organizations, happy to hop on a call and help you kind of put into play how you can use some art and mix it with a little behavioral science to make your survey respond a lot more like you would in a human way. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Very nice being here today.
So I think, one of the key points here is don't do surveys just to be doing the surveys. You saw the one survey design, unfortunately, that looks like some of the surveys that we've done. And, we're always looking to collect that information, but there are better ways to do it. And being a part of the arts community, certainly you have the tools and the access to do things, I think, a little better. This is a little time here for Q&A while we've got Max. He's an expert. Any questions, thoughts, or comments, or observations from anyone? So the question is, never seen any of these surveys. Where are they?
First, let me encourage you to write letters to all major corporations. Explain. That would be my first thing. I agree with you. It's a travesty. Regrettably, the truth is that the state of the state is still pretty bad. So thankfully, it's good for us from a business point of view in that organizations, locally, we talked about companies like Safeco Insurance or Alaska Airlines or Premier Blue Cross. They're recognizing that. And what's happened is that the ability to get this information is really important information. We haven't even talked about how you use the information within the company. That's a whole different topic, right? But they really need it. And people's willingness to give that information has gone down. So for us, that's been a boon. Our business doubles in size every year. But regrettably, the truth is that unless you're giving feedback to someone who's a Customerville client, surveys the UX has gotten better. It works, at least you're not like on your mobile phone kind of zooming in and trying to answer things. So the user experience has gotten better, but they still fail in ways that human interactions wouldn't. So I'm sad and thrilled that that's true. Any other questions? Erin, so Erin just asked a really good question. She said, you're looking at customer experience, basically. But there's also this idea of getting market research feedback. And how do these things intersect? And the truth is that originally, even up until recently, they were very different fields, right? You had people who said, I do the surveys for customer experience. And then you had another group of people who said, I do the research surveys. And what's interesting about that is if you think about it, that doesn't map to the real world. We have something we call the cocktail party thought exercise. You walk into a cocktail party full of your stakeholders, your customers, your sponsors, right? Important people for you to interact with. And what would be interesting about this is you can imagine you walk in, the customer experience person, the research person walk in, and they're talking to people. The way this would go is you wouldn't say, well, I'm going to ask you some customer experience questions. And then somebody else says, well, I'm sorry, I have to take you to a different place to ask you research questions. Humans are very good at cataloging a list of things they really want to know and understanding how much they can reasonably get, right? So you're talking to somebody and you'll say, hey, there's 100 things I want to know, but I can't ask you this. I'm going to ask 2 or 3 things. What we try and do is make it feel like this. We want the survey, and we do this for lots of our clients, the survey to ask customer experience questions, but then at some point it'll say, this is really cool. Like, thank you for sharing this feedback. Can I ask you a question? What do you think about this? Right? So you're mixing the 2 things together. That's a very human way of doing it. If you walked in, you're the customer experience person, the research person walk into a party together, the research person's probably dorkier than you, and so they're just going to be listening while you charm the pants off this customer or this whatever, right? But at the end, that person might say, this is really cool, and I'm fascinated listening to what you're saying. Can I ask you a question? I'm the researcher. What do you think about the color purple for the whatever, right? Or what do you think about painting the building red, or something like that, right? And what you find is that once people have invested in your story, they want to talk to you. They want to give you feedback. So this approach of design-driven feedback works equally well for both things. You might say that we're kind of blurring the lines between qualitative and quantitative research. Somebody had a question about the election before, and I didn't have time to answer it. That was the polling around the election was very interesting because it was just so wrong, right? Does anybody read the New York Times? Like, I love that. I look at it every morning. And for a year, they had that, remember that control they had in the beginning of the website? It said Hillary Clinton's chance of winning. And it kind of wobbled between 91% and 89% just because they didn't have the guts to say it's 100%, right? For like, how long was that thing out there? It was more than 6 months, right? And if you look at their website, those trend lines were the same until about 4 o'clock Pacific time when they went, ew, what happened there? And later, as you watch interviews with people, analysts and people who are in the press talking about this, they say, well, I saw one guy talking about, he was in the cabinet, said, oh, here's the election, who are you going to vote for? And the guy said, oh, I don't know, shame they can't both lose, or something kind of like that. But the guy knew there was something else going on there. And he kind of needled him over the course of the cab ride, and he said, come on, tell me what's going on. And the guy said, well, I come from XYZ town, and factories are all closed up. I'm not really happy with the way the economy's going. I think I'm going to vote for the other guy. I think I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. And the analyst who I saw this interview with him, he said, why were you afraid to tell me that? And he said, I felt like you were going to judge me, or I felt like, some things I don't like about the guy, and I felt like you weren't, I just didn't feel, I can't explain it. I didn't feel comfortable about that. So what's interesting about this is that any of us would have been able to see that. We would have seen his answer, and if we really wanted to know, we would have known something wasn't right. And we would have said, I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to give you permission to tell me what's on your mind. I want you to just speak your mind, right? But the polling frequently missed on that because people felt in responding to the polls that saying one thing meant that they accepted all this other awful baggage, right? So this is actually, we're doing a really interesting piece of research right now with Ipsos, who does a lot of research on this to figure out why is it that the polling failed when if I could have had any of you out there in the country interviewing people face-to-face, if we could clone you, you would have known how to do that. You would have known how to see through what was really happening there. So this is a fascinating field. It's a fascinating time to be in it, and we're learning a lot right now.
I was wondering if you could talk about how to use social media with surveying.
Yeah, social media for us is a channel. So think about once you make your survey, you need to share them out. You need to reach out and let people know it's out there. And there are 2 different types of surveys, in the broad sense. One, you're trying to get a body of information. The other is you're trying to establish a channel of communication that's an ongoing channel. You can blend those things a little bit. With social media, we find that's a great way. You need to be engaged with people. And this is a whole different presentation, and we've got some really cool materials we're happy to share for free on it. But you engage with people and let them know, hey, we're listening. We take this very seriously. We're listening. We really want to pay attention and learn from you. That's important for people to feel valued. As Don said, you'd be surprised how often people just are grateful that you asked for their opinion. Social media is a great way to send the message, just when we're really listening, we pay attention to this, and here is how you can give us feedback. There you go. Guys, thanks again for having me. This is really fun. I appreciate it.
So we're going to we're heading towards third base, and we're around third and heading towards home. I wanted to throw in a few things here that are directly related, nice segue into kind of why it's not really fun to be a pollster right now, because most of the pollsters were wrong. part of that has to do with the science of polling, and that is what we call margin of error. And I just thought one of the takeaways is to make sure you understand, and most of you probably do, that there is a margin of error applied to any survey that's done based on the science of surveying. So what this chart basically shows is based on sample size, which is across the bottom. If you have a certain size sample, the margin of error for that sample goes up or down depending on how big that sample is. Now most national samples were about 1,000 individuals. A lot of the polling, whether it's Ipsos or Gallup or any national type of survey, where you've got a big audience, a big universe, you have a sample of about 1,000 people. The margin of error of that 1,000 people, if you talk to 1,000 people, randomly selected, and they tell you X, Y, Z, the margin of error of that at the worst case scenario, which we have in many elections where it's a 50-50 split or close to 50-50, is 3.2% plus or minus. What that means is the range of error there is actually a little over 6%. Could be 47, could be 53. Any number that comes within that margin of error is actually an accurate number based on the sample. So if you look at a lot of the polls, they were within the margin of error. They were just on the wrong side of the margin of error. And so as a result of that happens. A lot of the samples that you do with your audiences are not 1,000 people or 1,500, 2,000 sometimes, but quite often they're much smaller. And so kind of a standard sample size is a sample of 400. So if you have 400 subscribers or 400 single ticket buyers, or 400 visitors to a museum, the margin of error of those percentage points is about plus or minus 5%. That's actually a very good statistical margin of error. It's a very accurate sample. But you can see that even a very small sample, like 100 or 200, has a larger margin of error, but it's still an accurate sample if it's done correctly. And by correctly, I mean you have to make sure that you get a representative cross-section of the visitors or the subscribers or whoever it is that you're looking at in that sample. So this is in the presentation. Maybe you've seen these charts before, but when you're thinking about surveys and you're looking at that audience, think in terms of how big of a sample should we have, what kind of margin of error we can live with. Most decisions that have a plus or minus 5% are okay. I mean, it's not life and death that you're dealing with in most cases, so it's a reasonable sample. The more you do, the bigger the sample. The great thing about new technologies is it is basically electrons. You can have a sample of 400 or you can have a sample of 4,000, and it's all electrons. In the old days, to do a sample of 4,000 telephone interviews would be cost prohibitive. Even to do 400 or 500 is expensive, especially if you're paying for that. To do 400 online surveys or 1,000 online surveys, we always recommend bigger is better because of what? It gives you the ability to segment your sample. So you can look at subscribers versus single ticket buyers, those kinds of things. So kind of keep that in mind. Another technique, and you can all use this whether you're doing online surveys or face-to-face interviews, is what we call word clouding. Today we ask a lot of open-ended questions, and so people will give us answers. They text those in an online survey. What do you do with all of those verbatim responses? You have to pour through them. So there is a technique, there's software that's called, you can go to it, it's called Wordle, WORDLE.net. This is free software where it allows you to take, for example, if you do a survey and you ask people, when you think of my organization, when you think of Seattle Symphony, what one word comes to mind? When you think of the Seattle Repertory Theater, what word comes to mind? When you think of Seattle Opera, what one word comes to mind? When you think of Wing Luke Museum, what one word comes to mind? And your survey participants will give you that in the online survey. They'll text that in. Capture all of that information, and you can put it into Wordle, and it'll create these word clouds for you. And the great thing about word clouds is it creates all kinds of creativity and discussion. What one or two words, the more often that word comes up in that survey, the bigger the font. And you can do lots of fun things and put these into reports. We presented this kind of information to boards. Boards love this kind of stuff. You know, they fall asleep when you give them graphs and charts, but give them a word cloud, they love it. And you can do a lot of things, very creative. And it's interesting and helpful to use this kind of a technique. And then one of the things that is really critically important in surveys and getting feedback is a measurement tool that's called the Net Promoter Score. How many of you know what the Net Promoter Score is? Very few. Good. Okay, so I'm giving you a tip today that is absolutely critical in business and in organizations, and that's to ask yourself, if there's one question that we want to ask our subscribers, our visitors, our audience, that one question that we want to ask has to do with how likely they would be to recommend us to someone else. The Harvard Business School did this huge study a few years back, and they went around and looked at all of the methodologies. They looked at lots of studies, big studies in terms of guest feedback and customer satisfaction, and they found that there was basically a question that asked people, how likely is it that you would recommend that company or that XYZ to a friend or colleague? And they decided that the rating scale was a 1 to 10 or sometimes a 0 to 10. 10 being very likely, 0 being very unlikely. The answer to that one question in this Harvard Business School study correlated most strongly to successful organizations, to financial performance, and to longevity. So the companies that got high Net Promoter Scores were the ones that were leaders in their particular industry. So this Net Promoter Score methodology is now being used in the arts. You can actually go online and look at Net Promoter Scores for museums, for ballet, for opera, for symphony, for repertory theater, for galleries. You can see Net Promoter Scores for a lot of organizations because they're beginning to feel that they need this information in order to really understand it. What happens is you calculate the Net Promoter Score by taking the results of that 1 to 10 scale very quickly, and you end up with 3 categories of people. One category are what we call the promoters. Those are those that give us either a 9 or a 10. Very highest rating on that Net Promoter Score. We have what we call the passives, which you would think, well, gee, somebody that gives me a 7 or an 8 on a 1 to 10 scale is an advocate. I mean, they're really supportive. No. According to the study that was done, it's been verified, replicated, verified again, those people who are satisfied but they're unenthusiastic about who they are and they're vulnerable to competitive offerings, meaning they're people that will either not subscribe next year, or they will start going somewhere else, or they just won't do anything at all. They're what are called passives. But those are people that you'd read in a report and say, wow, they're 7 or 8s. Those got to be great. They're not. The detractors are everybody else, people that give a 1 through a 6. You'd say, well, somebody on a 1 to 10 scale, if they give us a 5, that's good. That's a satisfactory rating. No, it's not. Those are people who can damage your brand, can damage your reputation. They're the ones that are talking about you in word of mouth. They're the ones that are basically degrading you on social media. So the 1 to 6 ratings are the ones that you really need to look at. You calculate the Net Promoter Score by taking the percentage of customers who are the promoters, meaning the 9s and the 10s, those percent, and you subtract the detractors, people that gave you 1 to 6. You totally throw out the 7s and 8s. They don't even count, and you get a Net Promoter Score. Here's some Net Promoter Scores for different organizations that are in the commercial sector. The one in the middle there is Comcast. They're actually lucky. I've seen ratings for Comcast that are like 2%. And you can actually have a negative Net Promoter Score. Thank you, Max. Yeah, I mean, that's really degrading. In fact, we had a bank customer that was acquiring lots of little banks, the big bank acquiring lots of little banks. and they ended up with a net promoter score from the acquisition, the customers of the banks that they acquired, it was a negative 33. Look at Tesla, 97%. That's like unbelievable. But if you talk to people who are people that own Teslas, you'll understand. USAA is a credit union. It's a bank credit union. It is the poster boy, poster child for the banking industry because they are almost perfect. Starbucks, 77%, which is very good. I don't have on here for arts organizations, but I've seen ratings for museums that are in the high 80s and low 90s. I've seen ratings for symphonies that are in the 70s and 80s, but there are also organizations that get ratings in the 40s and the 50s. The overall average net promoter score across the board is somewhere around 40 to 45. So it's not real good. So think in terms of the surveys that you do and include a net promoter score question. It's very simple, easy to ask, and then you can compare that net promoter score to other organizations.
We've got a guide. This is actually one of those things where it can be, you look at it and actually it can be a little overwhelming. It is easy. If you go to our website, customerville.com, there's an area called Pro Resources, and it's all free. We give it away. But we've got a guide on this that we wrote to kind of make it practicable. And feel free to download it, share it, use it amongst yourselves, but it kind of makes putting it to practice doable.
Another exercise is to ask internally what you think your net promoter score is. Ask your staff to rate what you think your net promoter score is. Invariably, you will give you and those within the four walls of the organization will give a lower net promoter score than what the external audience will give you. You know, you beat yourself up much more than you really should. But it's good because that gives you an aspirational target to really look at. So I want to bring this home because we're running out of time. Couple of things to keep that we've covered today or covered this morning, hopefully have given you thought for things that you could do differently. We couldn't cover everything in the time that we had. If questions come up, certainly you have access to all of us either through ArtsFund or directly. We're happy to, you can find our contact information online as well. If you have a particular project that you're doing that you'd like us to consult, we're more than happy to get on a call with you. So if you're designing a survey, or you're thinking about doing a focus group, or you're looking at the data that you already have on your quote-unquote customer base, or you're thinking about doing something on the development side with sponsors, with donors, you know, we can help you through that. I think the key thing is you want to make sure that you understand better how to engage these different audiences and do it in a way that really makes them want to participate. I think one of the key things that is important is make sure that you understand how to best communicate that with that audience. We know that response rates are going down. Participation in surveys is going down. People are worn out. They're getting tired. They're getting hit on all the time. We know that it's tough to get people actually out to focus groups because they like to stay home. So we have to give them a reason for doing that and make it much more involving and much more engaging. And if we can do that, it makes it a lot easier, and people will be more, I think, be more responsive. So kind of keep those things in mind as well. There's a lot of internal information that you already have on your audience, on your segments. But keep in mind that there's a whole big world of audience potential that's out there that may be a lot different than what you have now. And being able to analyze internally and externally, I think, is really, really critical. But the last slide here is research is just one layer of information. It is a very important layer. So if you don't have that one layer of information, you don't really have a full cake. You are missing a piece. but it is only one. Don't let the research guide your decision. Let the research add to the decisions that you're making, and take that in the sum total of all of the points of view that you have as an organization. You are the experts. You know, if you are involved in the arts, you are an expert in that genre, in that medium. So if you better understand more than anyone externally the business that you're in, but externally we're dealing with the perceptions of the audience and the perceptions of the public who potentially could be the next audience, keeping in mind that they don't know what you know, and they probably never will. But what they tell you in terms of why they do or don't do something, that's what you have to understand. And I think that's the layer of information that research can really provide to you, and provide it in a way that's very scientific and something that you can really use. So thank you for attending. Thank you for your for being our audience. I think we're pretty much at a hard close, but we will stick around for a few minutes. Please come up, ask us questions, and after the fact, anything that comes up that we can help you with, we're happy to do that. So I'll thank you. And